So I will be talking today about quantitative CT scanning in a variety of pulmonary disorders, and I want to let you know that the information that I'll be presenting, the data comes from our group, mainly from Dr. George Washko, who leads our CT scanning and imaging group in pulmonary disease, as well as some of his trainees, including Sam Ash and Lee Gazorian. They collaborated with our interstitial lung disease teams and our transplant team. So I'll be representing all of them. I'll talk to you a little bit about the background and technique of quantitative CT scanning, and then go through some of the data that's been generated from our division, looking at smokers who developed both COPD and ILD, and then also spending some time to talk about quantitative imaging in transplant rejection, because of course that's what I love, so I have to spend a little more time on that, and then tell you a little bit about future directions. So just to remind everyone, I'm sure you're familiar with the normal airway anatomy, but it's relevant to the technique of CT imaging, particularly when we talk about quantitative imaging. So recall that we start with the large airways, including the trachea and the main stem bronchi, and then we move down to the non-respiratory bronchioles. And as we move down further into the lung parenchyma, we end with the terminal bronchioles and then the alveolar ducts. And as we move down more distally into the airway anatomy, you see that the airways become more dilated, and they have these sacs attached to them which give them more surface area. And this becomes relevant as we talk about quantitative CT imaging, because these areas are going to be how we designate the quantitation that we use to actually create the scan. So the basics of quantitative CT imaging are relatively simple, although the technique becomes more complex very quickly. But remember that both the airways and the vasculature are essentially a tube that you can measure. So you can look at the total airway area, and then you can look at the luminal area, and when you subtract the luminal area from the total airway area, you end up with the luminal diameter. And you can use these measurements to create quantitative assessments of both airway and vascular measurements that you can then use for quantitation. We can also look at the circumference and various other measurements to add dynamic assessments to this. And anyone who wants to can actually do this. You can go to airwayinspector.org, and this technology using airwayinspector.org has actually been used in numerous studies looking at quantitative imaging in various disease states. So anyone can go on there to get a better sense of the technique of the actual scan. So I will start with this publication, which came out in the Blue Journal in 2013, again from Dr. Washko's group, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this because it's a good review of how the technique is actually used. So you can see here that we have some images, including non-emphysematous lungs, and then various forms of emphysematous lungs. And what's done here is that a human identifies an area of interest with a specific significant measure of abnormality in it. And the quantitation then begins to assess the various areas that I just described to you. And what's created is a histogram here. For the various disease states that were first identified by a clinician, the technique then uses this assessment tool via pixelation to create a histogram that talks about Hounsfield units. And the average Hounsfield units in each of these particular types of emphysema is then used to create a mean that can be then applied to the entirety of the parenchyma on CT scanning. And then you can create an image like this, which sums up the significant areas of various types of emphysema and then gives you a quantitative assessment. So that quantitation has been applied first in smokers. What our group did was take cohorts of smokers, mainly using the COPD gene cohort, which is a group of smokers, more than 10,000 patients participating. The primary aim of that cohort is to look at genetic abnormalities that predispose to the development of COPD and emphysema. However, many interesting studies have come out of the COPD gene cohort, first of all, looking at the risk of development of pulmonary abnormalities in patients who smoke, And then secondly, the identification of alternative abnormalities or potentially additional abnormalities on top of emphysema, such as interstitial lung disease, and I'll get to that information in a moment. So in this cohort of healthy non-smokers, this was first used to establish quantitative CCSA.